Hello everybody. This video will deal with ham radio repeaters. So let's get started. So in one of our previous classes we talked about handheld radios. And we know in this radio there is a transmitter and there is a receiver. Now when one handheld radio talks to another handheld radio, the radio travels out basically in a straight line. And typically a handheld radio, if you're a kid, it's probably 5 feet off the ground. If you're an adult, it might be 6. But in between, there are lots of things that absorb radio waves, like trees and buildings. So when you try to talk from one handheld to the next, it turns out that because of the clutter between you two, the radio waves that start out here get absorbed, and at some point there's just no radio waves left to receive. And typically on the devices that we use, we get 1 or 2 miles between handhelds. Well, the hams have come up with a pretty neat trick in order to get over that, and this is called a repeater system. So let me get a new sheet here. And we will explain how a repeater works. So we start out with our handheld that's really low to the ground. But now instead of transmitting directly to another handheld, let's transmit to a receiver that's on a very tall building. In our case, this is the First National Bank building, and it's a building that's 15 stories high. Or about 200 feet off the ground. All right, so let's start transmitting from our little handheld, and we have this receiver that sits on top of this building over here. And because it's high, the radio waves don't have to penetrate the trees or the surrounding buildings. So now we have a pretty good straight line of sight. Now here comes the trick. So if we take this receiver and we tie it to a transmitter, and this transmitter now looks down to another handheld, and notice that because we were on the high tall building or a tower or a mountain, is that there's nothing in the way to absorb these radio signals. And now the distance between the two handhelds can be in the range of 30 miles. Now there's another part to this trick, is that basically transmitters can only transmit and receivers can only receive. So we tie them together. But we also need one other thing, is that we need to change the frequency. So we will transmit out on a frequency called F sub t, frequency transmit. And when we receive over here, we will receive on a frequency called F sub r. And the reason we need to change frequencies is that, or essentially change channels, is that this transmitter, when it transmits out, is transmitting at the same time as this receiver, and this transmitter is much stronger than this one because it's separated by a few inches, and this thing can be separated by 30 miles. So we change frequencies. Now we will introduce a term called frequency or repeater offset. So the repeater offset is simply, let's write that, repeater and that is by definition the transmit frequency, F sub t minus F sub r. Okay, and repeaters, one of the bands that repeaters work in is 2 meters. And by tradition, the offset, the difference between the transmit frequency, is equal to 0.6 megahertz. And we know that 0.6 megahertz is also equal to 600 kilohertz. And we know the difference between a megahertz and a kilohertz is a factor of 1,000. Now, one of the other very common bands is the 440 meg band. And we know that sometimes we can express this in wavelengths, or the 70 centimeter band. The offset, by tradition, is 5 megahertz. Now, these kind of numbers are in the question pool, so you kind of ought to remember that 2 meters, the offset is 600 kilohertz, or the 70 centimeter band is 5 megahertz. I want to introduce two more terms to you, and one is called duplex. And this concept, duplex, means that you're doing two things. You're receiving and transmitting. So when we go through a repeater system, we at the repeater we transmit and receive at the same time, called duplex. The other term is called simplex. And by definition, we only do one thing at a time. So when we talk in one handheld to one handheld over here, we transmit and then we listen. So, let's kind of review. A repeater system, we use repeater systems to extend the range, and we do that by transmitting typically from a very low altitude transmitter to a very high altitude receiver to get away from the ground clutter, the trees. So we transmit out on one frequency to this receiver. This receiver then is hooked to a transmitter which we receive on a different frequency. And the difference between the transmit frequency and the receive frequency is called a repeater offset. And for 2 meters, that is 600 kilohertz. And for 440 megahertz, or 70 centimeters, it is 5 megahertz. And duplex, right? And these terms are in the question pool. Duplex means that we transmit and receive at the same time, and simplex is we do one at a time. So that's it for this video.